Right now, written language sits so completely embedded within ordinary daily life that it's truly easy to forget humans spent the overwhelming majority of our species' existence without any writing system whatsoever. Every text message, every book, every street sign traces back to a specific, remarkably late historical development, one that fundamentally transformed how humans could store and transmit information across time and distance. Let's dig into this properly, because the answer involves several independently developed writing traditions, a considerably later timeline than many people probably assume, and a seriously fascinating gradual evolution from simple record keeping toward full written language. Let's start with the earliest confirmed writing system, because this represents the necessary starting point for this entire discussion. The earliest confirmed writing system developed in ancient Mesopotamia, in the region corresponding to modern Iraq, roughly 5,400 years ago, with early cuneiform script initially developing specifically to track economic transactions, inventory, and trade records, rather than representing spoken language directly in any comprehensive way. This detail matters considerably, since it means writing's original purpose was overwhelmingly practical and administrative, rather than representing some kind of deliberate attempt to capture literature, poetry, or spoken conversation from the very outset. This detail is worth sitting with directly, because it reframes the entire question in a useful way. Writing wasn't invented as a general purpose tool for recording any kind of human thought or speech. It developed specifically to solve a particular practical problem, reliably tracking economic transactions and resource allocation within increasingly complex ancient Mesopotamian society, only gradually expanding to represent considerably broader categories of information and eventually spoken language more comprehensively across subsequent centuries of continued development and refinement. Let's talk about how cuneiform actually developed from earlier record-keeping systems, because this represents an important, well-documented developmental process worth exploring in additional depth. Archaeological evidence suggests cuneiform writing developed gradually from an earlier system involving small clay tokens, each representing a specific quantity of a particular traded good, which merchants and administrators used for tracking transactions before eventually representing these same tokens as pressed symbols directly on clay tablets, gradually evolving into the wedge-shaped cuneiform symbols researchers study today. This detail reinforces a familiar pattern already explored extensively throughout other topics regarding ancient technological development. Writing didn't emerge as a single, sudden invention, but rather developed gradually from an already established practical record-keeping tradition, with each successive stage building directly upon the previous one across many generations of continued refinement. Let's talk about ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic writing too, because it represents another early, independently developed writing tradition worth exploring specifically. Egyptian hieroglyphics developed at a broadly similar early historical period to Mesopotamian cuneiform, though researchers continue actively debating exactly how independently these two traditions actually developed, given some evidence suggesting possible early contact and influence between these two neighboring ancient civilizations. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing combined both phonetic symbols representing specific sounds and logographic symbols representing entire words or concepts directly, creating a considerably complex, sophisticated writing system that Egyptian scribes used across a remarkably long span of subsequent history, remaining in active use for well over 3,000 years. Let's talk about Chinese writing specifically too, because this represents a clearly independently developed writing tradition worth exploring in additional depth, given how confidently researchers can establish its independent origin separate from the Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions already discussed. Chinese writing developed roughly 3,400 years ago, with early confirmed examples found inscribed on ancient turtle shells and animal bones, used specifically for divination purposes within ancient Chinese religious and political practice. Remarkably, modern Chinese writing maintains direct historical continuity with this ancient writing system, representing one of the longest continuously used writing traditions anywhere in the world, with many modern Chinese characters directly tracing their specific visual form back to these ancient origins many thousands of years ago. Let's talk about Mesoamerican writing systems too, because they represent yet another completely independently developed writing tradition worth exploring specifically, given how thoroughly disconnected this development was from any of the Old World writing traditions already discussed extensively throughout this topic. Various Mesoamerican civilizations, including notably the Maya, developed sophisticated writing systems combining logographic and phonetic elements used for recording historical events, religious and astronomical information, and various other significant categories of information within these specific ancient societies. This detail reinforces a compelling pattern already explored extensively throughout other topics regarding independent human technological convergence. Writing developed independently across multiple, completely separate world regions, with no possible contact or shared cultural transmission between the Mesoamerican tradition specifically and any of the Old World writing traditions already discussed throughout this topic. Let's talk about the Indus Valley script specifically too, because this represents a particularly intriguing, unresolved case worth exploring in additional depth. The ancient Indus Valley civilization, flourishing roughly 4,300 years ago across parts of modern Pakistan and India, left behind numerous short inscriptions using a distinctive symbolic system found on seals, pottery, and various other artifacts. Despite considerable sustained scholarly effort, researchers still haven't definitively deciphered this particular script, and some researchers continue actively debating whether it represents true writing capable of recording spoken language or a more limited symbolic system serving other specific purposes, illustrating that even with extensive archaeological evidence available, definitively confirming and understanding an ancient writing system can remain a truly unresolved scholarly challenge even after generations of dedicated research effort. Let's talk about Rongo Rongo, the mysterious script found on Easter Island too, because this represents another fascinating, still poorly understood writing tradition worth exploring specifically. This distinctive script, found inscribed on wooden tablets, remains almost entirely undeciphered even today, and researchers continue debating basic questions regarding whether it actually represents genuine writing capable of recording spoken Rapa Nui language, or some other form of symbolic or mnemonic system. This detail is worth including because it demonstrates that our understanding of ancient writing systems remains seriously incomplete even now, with certain specific historical writing traditions continuing to resist confident scholarly interpretation despite considerable dedicated research effort extending across many decades. Let's talk about cuneiform's remarkable versatility and its eventual widespread regional adoption too, because this represents an important detail worth exploring in additional depth. Beyond its original Mesopotamian context, already discussed extensively throughout this topic, cuneiform script proved remarkably adaptable, eventually being used to write several completely different, unrelated languages across the broader ancient Near East, including Akkadian, Hittite, and several other ancient languages, demonstrating that a specific writing system could successfully separate from its original specific language and be adapted to represent entirely different languages, a pattern that would later repeat with the alphabet's eventual widespread adoption across numerous unrelated language families throughout subsequent history. Let's talk about the specific archaeological discovery of massive ancient clay tablet archives too, because this represents compelling, concrete evidence worth exploring specifically, illustrating just how extensively and how systematically ancient societies eventually relied upon writing once it became sufficiently established. Archaeologists have discovered massive archives, containing tens of thousands of individual cuneiform tablets at various ancient Mesopotamian sites, documenting everything from royal correspondence and legal contracts through detailed administrative records and even early literary works, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, among the oldest surviving substantial works of literature anywhere in the world. This detail reinforces an important point worth appreciating throughout this entire discussion. Once writing became sufficiently established within a given ancient society, it rapidly expanded well beyond its original narrow administrative purpose already discussed at the beginning of this topic, eventually supporting an enormously wide range of different social, legal, religious, and eventually literary applications and functions. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about how scribal training actually worked within these ancient literate societies too, because this represents an interesting, practically grounded dimension worth exploring specifically. Becoming a trained scribe within ancient Mesopotamian or Egyptian society typically required years of dedicated formal education, since mastering the many hundreds of distinct cuneiform or hieroglyphic symbols required considerably more extensive training compared to the simpler alphabetic systems that would eventually develop later. This extensive training requirement helps explain why why literacy remained so consistently restricted to a comparatively narrow professional class throughout these early literate societies. Since the sheer time and resource investment required to achieve genuine written proficiency within these more complex logographic systems made widespread general literacy considerably less practically achievable compared to what alphabetic writing would eventually make possible. Let's talk about writing materials and their significant effect on which ancient texts actually survived for modern researchers to study too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Different ancient writing traditions relied on considerably different physical materials, with Mesopotamian cuneiform typically pressed into clay tablets that, once fired or naturally dried, proved remarkably durable and long-lasting, while Egyptian hieroglyphics were frequently written on papyrus, a considerably more fragile organic material that survives far less reliably across extended archaeological time except under unusually favorable preservation conditions like Egypt's specific dry desert climate. This detail helps explain why researchers have access to such an enormous quantity of surviving Mesopotamian written material compared to the comparatively more limited surviving papyrus documents from ancient Egypt, despite both civilizations clearly producing enormous quantities of written material during their own respective historical periods. Let's talk about how writing specifically enabled increasingly complex legal and administrative systems too, because this represents an important, closely related consequence worth exploring before continuing this broader discussion. Once writing became sufficiently established within a given ancient society, it enabled considerably more sophisticated legal codes, standardized contracts, and reliable long-distance administrative communication, connecting directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding how increasingly complex ancient civilizations and governmental systems actually developed and functioned. Written legal codes specifically, including famous examples like the Code of Hammurabi, provided a considerably more consistent, more widely verifiable standard for legal judgment compared to purely oral legal tradition, representing another significant, practically important consequence of writing's gradual historical development and increasing societal integration. Let's talk about the specific distinction between writing and earlier symbolic systems too, because this represents an important conceptual clarification worth addressing directly. Researchers generally distinguish true writing, capable of representing spoken language with enough precision that a reader unfamiliar with the original specific message could still accurately reconstruct its intended meaning, from earlier, less comprehensive symbolic systems, including various forms of pictographic record-keeping and mnemonic devices that could convey general information, but couldn't precisely represent the full complexity of actual spoken language. This distinction matters considerably for properly understanding why researchers specifically identify Mesopotamian cuneiform as representing the earliest true writing system, rather than crediting even earlier symbolic systems that, while really significant precursor developments, didn't yet achieve this specific threshold of comprehensively representing spoken language. Let's talk about the alphabet's specific, considerably later development too, because this represents an important, distinct chapter in this broader writing history worth exploring specifically. The alphabet, using individual symbols to represent specific sounds rather than entire words or syllables, developed considerably later than the earlier writing systems already discussed throughout this topic, with the earliest confirmed alphabetic systems emerging in the eastern Mediterranean region roughly 3,800 years ago, eventually developing into the Phoenician alphabet that directly influenced the Greek alphabet, and subsequently the Latin alphabet still used across much of the world today. This detail is worth appreciating because the alphabet represented a actually significant simplification compared to the earlier writing systems already discussed extensively throughout this topic, requiring considerably fewer individual symbols to represent an entire language compared to logographic systems requiring separate symbols for every individual word or concept, making alphabetic literacy considerably more achievable and widespread compared to the more specialized, extensively trained scribal literacy that earlier logographic writing systems typically required and supported. Let's talk about literacy rates throughout most of subsequent human history too, because this represents an important, often underappreciated detail worth exploring before continuing this broader discussion. Despite writing's early development already discussed extensively throughout this topic, widespread literacy remained remarkably limited throughout most of subsequent human history, with reading and writing typically restricted to a comparatively small proportion of the population, including scribes, religious officials, and various administrative and merchant classes, rather than representing a broadly, universally shared skill across the general population. This detail is worth appreciating because it means writing's invention, however historically significant, didn't immediately transform ordinary daily life for the majority of people living within these ancient and subsequent historical technological societies, with truly widespread mass literacy representing a considerably more recent historical development connected to later technological and social developments, including the printing press and, eventually, formal mass public education systems already explored extensively in other discussions regarding this topic. Let's talk about how the Phoenician alphabet specifically spread and influenced so many subsequent writing systems too, because this represents an important, historically significant chapter worth exploring in additional depth. Phoenician traders, operating extensive maritime trade networks throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, carried their relatively simple, efficient alphabetic writing system to numerous different regions and cultures they regularly traded with, directly influencing the eventual development of the Greek alphabet, which itself later influenced the Latin alphabet still used across much of the world today, alongside various other writing systems including Hebrew and Arabic script, both also tracing significant historical influence back to this same early Phoenician alphabetic tradition. This detail illustrates how a single, particularly efficient writing innovation could spread remarkably widely through sustained trade contact, eventually influencing written communication across an enormous geographic range extending well beyond the alphabet's own specific original Phoenician cultural context. Let's talk about the printing press's eventual, considerably later connection to this broader writing history too, because this represents an important subsequent chapter worth including before this discussion concludes. While writing itself developed many thousands of years earlier, as already extensively discussed throughout this topic, the printing press's development, particularly Johannes Gutenberg's specific innovations during the 15th century, dramatically transformed how written material could actually be reproduced and distributed, moving beyond the labor-intensive hand copying that had characterized written text reproduction throughout virtually the entire span of writing's prior history, already discussed extensively throughout this topic. This technological development connects directly to broader questions already explored in other discussions regarding how mass literacy eventually became practically achievable, since printing dramatically reduced the cost and time required to produce written material, gradually making written text considerably more widely accessible compared to the expensive, labor-intensive hand-copied manuscripts that had previously limited written material's practical availability and distribution. Let's talk about how modern digital writing connects back to this extensive historical tradition too, because this represents a fitting, contemporary continuation worth exploring before wrapping up this broader discussion. Modern digital text, despite representing an enormous technological leap beyond anything the earliest cuneiform scribes could have possibly imagined, still fundamentally relies on the same basic underlying principle those ancient scribes first developed, using visual symbols to represent and preserve language across time and distance. This continuity is worth appreciating because it demonstrates that despite dramatic changes in the specific physical medium writing actually uses, clay tablets, papyrus, printed paper, and now digital screens, the fundamental conceptual breakthrough those earliest Mesopotamian record keepers first achieved continues underlying virtually every form of written communication still used throughout the entire modern world today. Let's talk about how researchers continue actively working to decipher remaining undeciphered ancient scripts too, because this represents a fitting way to close out this discussion, connecting directly back to some of the genuine remaining mysteries already touched on earlier regarding the Indus Valley script and Rongorongo specifically. Researchers continue actively applying increasingly sophisticated computational and linguistic analysis techniques specifically toward these remaining undeciphered ancient writing systems, occasionally achieving meaningful breakthroughs. Though several significant ancient scripts, including the two specific examples already discussed extensively throughout this topic, remain substantially or entirely undeciphered even today, representing seriously significant, ongoing scholarly challenges that continue actively motivating dedicated research effort across multiple different academic disciplines simultaneously. Let's talk about how researchers actually study and confirm these various independent writing origins too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Researchers rely on careful archaeological excavation and dating of surviving written artifacts, alongside detailed comparative linguistic and symbolic analysis capable of tracing how a given writing system's specific symbols evolved and changed over time, allowing researchers to construct increasingly detailed, historically confident timelines for each of these independently developed writing traditions already explored throughout this discussion. Let's talk briefly about how writing's development fundamentally changed the nature of human knowledge transmission across generations too, because this represents a fitting, reflective final point worth including before this discussion concludes. Before writing's development, human knowledge and cultural memory depended entirely on oral transmission, requiring each successive generation to accurately memorize and pass down important information through direct human teaching and repetition, an inherently limited and gradually degrading process compared to the considerably more reliable, precise preservation writing eventually made possible. This fundamental shift toward external externally, reliably preserved information represents one of the most historically significant, though sometimes underappreciated, consequences of writing's development, allowing human knowledge to accumulate and build upon itself across many successive generations with far greater precision and reliability than purely oral transmission alone could ever have realistically sustained. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full story of when humans invented writing turns out to reveal a considerably more gradual, considerably more geographically distributed development than any simple, single-origin narrative could ever fully capture. Writing first developed in ancient Mesopotamia roughly 5,400 years ago, specifically to address practical record-keeping needs, before independently developing across several other completely separate world regions, including Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica, each tradition arising through its own distinct developmental process. The alphabet's later development considerably simplified written communication, though truly widespread literacy remained limited throughout most of subsequent human history until considerably more recent historical developments finally made broad literacy practically achievable. So the next time you casually read or write something without giving it a second thought, it's worth appreciating that you're using a technology considerably younger than agriculture, and countless other significant human developments representing one of the more remarkably recent, transformative achievements in our entire species' history, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as fundamental to modern civilization as writing actually developed this independently across multiple separate regions, each starting from practical, unglamorous record-keeping needs rather than any grand literary ambition, what does that suggest about how frequently history's most transformative developments actually emerge from modest, practical necessity rather than deliberate, visionary invention?